Quad 66. So this is the video that I'm finally getting to. This is the part that I find interesting. I think probably most of you out there, I'm probably going to lose you. Probably nobody else is going to care, but I think it's interesting. Anyway, so what we're doing in this video is drilling down into trying to see what parameters, when you're talking about motors, like the diameter of the stator, the height of the stator, the kV, the ratio, what parameters are the things that affect the things that we want when we're looking for performance in terms of response rate, efficiency, and thrust. So this data is from Carl Pablo. His site is linked below. Please check out his site and give him that traffic, because he's done a ton of work on this, and it really was a lot of work to get this going. And now I'm just doing the fun stuff with tinkering with it and analyzing it. So if you also didn't watch my previous couple of videos on this, please do, because I'm going to be talking about some of these things that we talked about in those prior videos in terms of our FPCA score on thrust. So that's summarizing thrust, that whole thrust curve in one principal component. And then also our efficiency, which got broken up into two components, which is effectively a low-end efficiency and a high-end. And then our response rate. Our response rate is the way that we normalized how these motors respond to a jump from 10% to 30% throttle and from 10% to 60% throttle, and not penalize the motors that have a bigger RPM change. And so response rate is change in RPM per millisecond, and it normalizes, and that's the metric we're going with there. The other things that are in here are the surface area of the motor, the ratio of the stator, so surface area of the stator, and some other factors that I ultimately dropped, and I'll show you why I dropped some of those, and then our good old friend kV there. The motors is the same ones, so this is the 1204 to 1303 batch, and you can see the motors that we have here. Again, if you want all the details and that kind of stuff, go to Carl's site and take a look. Well, let's jump into analysis. So one of the first things I have to do is when I bring this data, one of the first things I did is I centered and scaled this data. The reason I did that, and what that does, is you can see that we lose the units on these parameters, but it puts all the parameters kind of onto a level playing field. So even though we're making apples to orange comparisons, this kind of allows us to do it from a statistical perspective, because now we've brought everything kind of into the same range, and now we're not asking too much of our statistical model. Okay, so once that was centered and scaled, one of the things to do is we've got a ton of parameters. We can't use all of them. So what I did is I wanted to get kind of the lay of the land, and a good way to do that is using this correlation plot here. And so on this correlation plot, what it does is if it's positive, if it's a big blue circle, it means it's positively correlated. If it's a big red circle, it's highly inversely correlated. And things that are, very small circle or faint, those don't have much correlation at all. And what we want to do is we want to pick things that, for the model, that aren't highly correlated, because you don't want the same parameter kind of telling the same story. You want kind of independent ones. And so I spent some time digging through these and picked out the ones that were both kind of relatively independent and also talking about kind of the parameters that are sort of useful or easy to talk about and make sense. And so those parameters that I picked out are the surface ratio of the stator, because that's just a good thing to describe how big is this motor. So it kind of normalizes for tall versus high. It's like it just doesn't care. It's just how much surface area has is there on the stator. Also the ratio. A lot of the discussion, or a lot of the new innovation, or so-called innovation on motors, is changing to different geometries of motors, particularly with looking at wider stators and shorter heights, trying to pick up torque and efficiency, and also our old friend kV. And so I ran these parameters and looked at how well do they explain these different things. How well do they explain thrust? How well do they explain efficiency and the response rate? And some of the results were very straightforward and made sense, and which is good. It's what you want to see, because it tells you your statistics and your modeling is working. But so on the first one, looking at thrust, the big predictors were the surface area, not surprising, bigger motor, bigger thrust, and also the kV. The higher the kV, the bigger the thrust. Makes sense, good. Things got a little bit more interesting when we started looking at efficiency. So with efficiency, I was a little bit surprised that we got nothing out of it. And that may be just because we're underpowered here, and maybe there's like these confounding variables, because I would have expected kV to probably pop out here, but our only motor that we used that had a lower KV was just the one, I forget which one it was. I'd have to look back. But anyways, it was one of our 1204 motors, I believe, and the others had a very restricted range on KV, and so it didn't pop out. And that was true at the low end and at the high end. And then going to, I think the metrics, to me, that's more interesting, because what I'm looking for with a quad, I want responsiveness when I fly a quad. So when we looked at a response rate, it was interesting to me. It wasn't the surface area, it wasn't just bigger motors, and it wasn't just the KV, but it was actually the ratio. I was kind of surprised that popped out, because, and the way it popped out was that it was inversely correlated. So when I'm calculating the ratio in here, what I'm saying is diameter divided by height. So your wider, flatter motors have a higher ratio, and it's inversely correlated with your responsiveness. So in our case, our 1204 motors are more responsive than our 1303. And that was the opposite of what's supposed to be, because you're supposed to go wider, supposed to get more torque, and you're supposed to get more responsiveness. And so this is kind of an interesting, because some of that theory that's been put out there and people think they kind of feel it in the air, well, objectively, we went and found this objectively, and it didn't really pan out that way. Now again, restricted range of motors here, and there could be confounders, but to the best data that I have that I could get my hands on, this isn't panning out the way it's sort of been, you know, kind of some people thought might work out. So I thought that that was super interesting. Okay, so then the last thing for me to kind of think about too is, like, when we're thinking about a response rate, is it more these kind of like geometry of the motor, or is it just really how the motor performs? So for example, is it really that ratio, or is that ratio really kind of like correlated with other things like the thrust and efficiency, and is that what's really driving this? And at the end of the day, I think it's really these other things driving it. So although the ratio popped out interesting, I think you can actually still get there more by less, like with different ratios, you can end up with the more responsive motor depending on how you tune it to get your thrust and efficiency. So what you can see here is in this last model, when we're looking at a response rate, the things that really popped out are the thrust and efficiency. And so to me, that makes sense, because the more powerful your motor is, the more thrust it can generate, the more responsive it's going to be. Totally makes sense. Also, if you're more responsive, you're going to give up efficiency, right? There's no free lunch. It makes sense. If you can, you know, if your motor can burn this energy faster, it's going to create that RPM change faster. It's kind of like the physics of it, and lo and behold, it actually works. So anyway, so what that tells us is that although on the surface you can probably look at your ratio and say your taller motors are actually going to probably be more responsive, but at the end of the day, what you really want to look at is your thrust and your efficiency. And if you want responsiveness, what you're looking for is high thrust, low efficiency. For the visual types, kind of a couple of plots to finish up here. So this is a plot of that motor responsiveness and the ratio here. So the taller motors, higher responsiveness, wider motors, lower responsiveness. And then kind of the big one at the end of the day for me, efficiency. So the less efficient your motor is, the more responsiveness you're going to get out of it. If you get into these crazy efficient motors, hey, it look great on paper in that way, but it's not going to be as responsive. And so that's what I'm looking for. I want the responsive motor. I'm willing to sacrifice some efficiency to get it, and maybe you're different. Maybe you're going long range. Anyways, much more to come. We've got a much bigger data set with the 1103 motors and the 2S. We'll expand on this data set, but I think this should give you an insight into what we can do by getting objective data and analyzing it statistically. All right. Hope you made it through this and enjoyed it. Until next time, cheers.